Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at the New Testament manuscripts in our continuing study of how we got our Bible. The New Testament, remember, is written in Greek, at least all the copies that we have. Now, there's an old tradition that says Matthew originally wrote it, the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew, and then it was translated by either him or by others into Greek. We don't have it in Hebrew, so we're going to have to go in all of these cases with the Greek text. And in most cases, the original was written in Greek, Matthew perhaps aside. And after all, the audience in most cases were Greek-speaking, either Greek-speaking Jews or Greek-speaking Gentiles. So it's written in Greek, Koine Greek versus Classical. Classical is a bit earlier, and after the coming of Alexander the Great in 333 BC, the entire Eastern world had learned to speak Greek as a second language. But in doing so, the Greek language had gone through some simplification and through some modification, in much the same way that English has been changed by people in the United States. I first started school living in England as a child. And we came to the United States, and I thought, oh my goodness, what language are these people speaking? Well, it was English. It was just modified a bit. And so the New Testament's in Koine as opposed to Classical. The types of writing that we have, first of all, the uncials, these are capital letters. In the 1st through the 8th century, it was the practice when anyone wrote. They didn't, as a rule, write with, you know how we write in capitals and then small letters and cursive writing. Everything is written in uncials until you get past the 8th century, from the 9th century to the 16th century. And of course, after that, remember, you have the printing press, so that's going to change. But you have the use of minuscules, that is, capital letters only for the names and for the beginning of a sentence, but then the rest of the text is in smaller letters. The composition forms that we have, two primary ones. We have scrolls. Those tend to be the earlier ones, although very early in history, the Christians in particular began to make use of the codex, that is, the bound book. One of the advantages of the bound book is you can turn from not just one page to the next, but you can actually flip back a number of pages. You can't do that easily with a scroll. You have to just unroll the scroll or re-roll it to wherever you were prior. So the codex makes it easy to move around to different places within the text. We have several different textual families. We've talked about this already. You have the Proto-Alexandrian text, that's your earliest, and both the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus are part of this. We're going to get to know those two texts, but also even earlier than those are some of your papyri, where very early in the history of the church you have the New Testament being copied onto papyri, and some of these date as early as the 2nd century. The Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus a bit later. They're on the higher end, around the 4th century. Next, we have the Alexandrian, and so we did make a distinction between the early Alexandrian, the Proto-Alexandrian, versus the Alexandrian text. An example of this is the Ephraemi Rescriptus. We're going to talk about that one, where the text was copied over. Somebody else copied over the biblical text, tried to erase it, scrape it off, and rewrite something over that. But now we've discovered both, not just the later writing, but the original biblical text that was underneath that. And that's an Alexandrian text. Next, there is the Western text. These are largely Latin texts, although not all of them. We actually have even a portion of the Proto-Alexandrian where most of the manuscript is Proto-Alexandrian, and yet a portion of that is actually following the Western reading. And then finally, we have the Byzantine text. Now, a great many of our manuscripts, in fact, we have more Byzantine manuscripts than all of the others put together. And it's from this category that we have the Textus Receptus. The Alexandrinus actually follows the Byzantine text when it comes to the Gospels. And these are a bit later, from the 5th to the 10th century. So even the earliest ones are a bit later in date. Let's talk then about individual texts. First of all, we have Codex Alexandrinus, also known as Codex A. It makes it sort of easy to remember. They're all going to get a letter designation until you run out of letters. You go, through the letters of the alphabet, and then after that, they're going to get a numerical designation. There'll be one exception. We'll mention that when we get to the Sinaiticus. It's going to use a Hebrew letter. But all the others use Greek letters for their designation. So Codex A or Codex Aleph, and it's written 450 AD. It contains the Septuagint and the New Testament. Notice in the copy to our right, it's written in 2 columns. That's good. That makes it a little bit easier to read. When you're reading one column all the way across, it's easy to lose your place. So this makes it a bit easier. It was kept in Alexandria, and then the Patriarch of Constantinople presented it to the King of England in the year 1627. I can't help but wonder if he had presented it to the King of England maybe 20 years or so earlier, how our King James might have been affected. But that wasn't the case. They had only later manuscripts, much later manuscripts, to work from in the King James. And so that's going to impact the translation, and we'll look at that when we talk about translations. Next, we have Codex Beta, or Codex B, the Vaticanus. Again, it contains the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, as well as the New Testament. Notice in our picture to the right, it actually has 3 columns across. Again, makes it easy. Notice there are some editorial notes in the margins. The copyist has to be aware of those. It's dated to about 350 AD, once Christianity had become legalized, and we have this copy being made. Indeed, we are told by Eusebius that Constantine, after he declared himself to be a Christian, he ordered 50 copies of the Bible to be made. And there are some who think maybe this copy is either one of those or copied from one of those. And I think that's entirely possible. It's a very carefully professional looking manuscript. Remember, it's all handwritten. It's missing 71 pages. Now, we don't know what happened to those pages. After all, a lot can happen over 1600 years. Napoleon took the Vatican Library to Paris in 1809, and with it went the Codex Vaticanus. But then about 6 years later, he had the Battle of Waterloo, and the Codex was returned to the Vatican in 1815, and there it remained to this day. A young man by the name of Samuel Tregelles was permitted to examine it in 1845. He was an evangelical Christian from a denomination known as the Plymouth Brethren. He examined it, but he was not permitted to take in any paper or pencils. They didn't really have photography quite yet, so he wasn't able to photograph. But even he wasn't allowed to even take notes, but was allowed to examine it for an extended period of time. Eventually, the entire manuscript was photographed and published in 1890, and nowadays you have digital versions of it you can look at online, so you're able to look at the actual Codex Vaticanus. That's the same with all of these manuscripts. Next, we have the Ephraemi Rescriptus. The manuscript itself contained translations of sermons of Father Ephraim the Syrian, probably written in Syriac back in the 300s, but then they'd been translated into Greek, and so these sermons were in this manuscript, but apparently the person who was copying them down didn't have much in the way of parchment, and so he looked about. The parchment's rather expensive, and so he found an old faded Bible that no one was using, and he basically erased all the pages from the Bible, and he put these sermons over top of them. This is what is known as a palimpsest. It means scraped again, and that's why we refer to it being a rescriptus, and then something was rewritten over it, and these sermons were copied in the 12th century. Much later, in the 1600s, a Protestant pastor by the name of Pierre Elix noticed the writing underneath the palimpsest. Um, and he could barely make it out, but he began to puzzle it out, and it was noted that this was a biblical text underneath. And it has been dated to the 5th century. One of our, again, remember this was a Alexandrian text, one of the very early copies of the New Testament had been erased, but we've been able to retain and bring back the original writing and determine how that read. It contains some of the Septuagint, but most of the surviving pages are from the New Testament. It also contains the long ending of Mark. Remember we talked about the long ending of Mark that was missing from the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, but it is in the Ephraemi Rescriptus, and we also noted that it was even quoted by Irenaeus. Here's a look at that manuscript. You can see the writing, and then you can see the fainter writing underneath. The fainter writing beneath it is the biblical text. The next manuscript we want to speak of is the Codex Sinaiticus. Now, as I said before, they all have Greek letter designations, except for this one. This is known as Codex Aleph. Aleph is the first letter, not in the Greek alphabet, but the Hebrew alphabet. And von Tischendorf, the discoverer, wanted it to be distinctive, and so he gave it that particularly distinctive designation. Count Constantine von Tischendorf was actually going around the ancient world. He was on the lookout for manuscripts, and he visited St. Catherine's Monastery in 1844, a very ancient monastery dating back, well, in his day it was over 1,000 years old. And notice on the picture you can see Mount Sinai, and to the left you can barely see that little greenery. That's the monastery. It's on the slopes of Mount Sinai. Here's another picture showing just from the other end and a little bit closer to the monastery. The monastery is still standing there today. You can still go there today and see the monastery. The Codex Sinaiticus isn't there any longer, but the monastery still stands, and they have been continually occupied for 1,500 years. Tischendorf was spending he probably spent several days. Today there's tourists that go by the monastery all the time. Back then they did not have easy roads and easy access, so they weren't used to having tourists. And it gets very cold there, as I discovered. I was there in April, and at night it can get quite chilly. It was apparently when he was there too, and they had stoked up the fireplace. And the way he tells the story, he looked down into a basket of things that were being used for kindling to stoke up the fire, and he saw what looked like a manuscript, a page of a codex. And he picked it up and he looked at it and he could see the writing. He could read it, and lo and behold, it was biblical text. And he got all excited and he said, "Do you have any more of these?" And they showed him more. And the way he tells the story, they had been using these biblical texts as kindling to light the fires of their fireplace. Now, they tell a different story. They say, no, there was a basket of kindling, and it had some old things that were being thrown away, but not these manuscript pages. He mistook that. That was a different basket, not meant for such an end. So was it a case where Tischendorf embellished, or was it a case of misunderstanding? Although he could read Greek, sometimes reading Greek versus speaking Greek is two entirely different things. And so perhaps this was a result of misunderstanding. In any case, 129 pages were initially discovered. They had been written, they've been since then dated to around 350 AD. Again, in this period immediately after Constantine. Possibly, it's a very majestic looking manuscript. We'll look at that in just a moment. Tischendorf was permitted to take 43 pages away with him. The rest had to remain there with the monastery. And the manuscript from the monastery was eventually given to Tsar Nicholas of Russia. And so there's nothing left there at the monastery, at least from that time on. The USSR, when remember Russia fell to in the communist revolution to the communists, and subsequently they just their statement of faith is that they have no faith in God or Christianity, and so they sold the Codex to the British Museum in 1933 for £100,000. Um, that's possibly the most expensive book ever sold. Remember, adjusted for inflation. That was an incredible amount of money. And so it went then to the British Museum. However, a forgotten room was discovered in 1975. We would call that, if it was a Jewish synagogue, we'd call that a geniza, a closet. And it contained more ancient manuscript fragments. And studies began to be made of those. And then in 2009, another page was found of the Codex Sinaiticus. So as recently as in the last 10 years, things continue to be found, and who knows what will be found there next. Here's a facsimile of the actual codex. We're looking at, notice that some open pages. It's in 4 columns on each page. It's very, very carefully written. This is very professionally produced. This could well be one of those early copies that Constantine ordered to be made. It's obviously to be read from the pulpit. It's a very professional job, very lovingly and painstakingly put together. We'll look at several others. The Oxyrhynchus papyri were discovered by Grenfell and Hunt, pictured here below. They were doing an excavation south of the Fayum oasis in Egypt at a place called Oxyrhynchus. They came across a bunch of stuffed crocodiles, and they examined them a bit more closely, and the stuffing turned out to be that they were stuffed with papyri containing, at least in some cases, portions of the New Testament. Now, they weren't all filled with New Testament, but included in there were some copies of the New Testament. Our oldest copy of any portion of the New Testament is the John Rylands Papyri. It's known as Papyri 52. You'll see it sometimes designated as P52, named for the John Rylands University. It was acquired by Grenfell of the Grenfell and Hunt team in 1920 and dates somewhere between 90 and 150 AD. This piece was copied in the next generation after the Gospel of John had been written. It's a single scrap. You're looking at the entire piece of papyri. It's one part of one page, and it was found. It's written on both sides, which means that this was part of a papyri codex, because you wouldn't normally you wouldn't write a scroll on both sides. That would make it very unwieldy to read. On one side it has John 18 verses 31 through 33. On the other side it has John 18, 37 and 38, just portions of the verse, but enough where we can tell what is being said. This is our oldest portion of any part of the New Testament. The Chester Beatty papyri these papyri were purchased from an antiquities dealer by an American millionaire by the name of Chester Beatty. It contained epistles of Paul dating to the 2nd century. These are some of our oldest copies of the epistles. Most of it now is at the University of Pennsylvania. I believe there are 2 other sections that are in some other universities. I don't remember off the top of my head where they are. But in conclusion, we can say that there were more than 5,000 Greek manuscripts that have been found, which means we have a plethora, a huge amount of manuscripts that we can compare one with the other. This is more than any other ancient document. The New Testament has been copied, and of course, when we say Greek manuscripts, some of those are Old Testament Septuagint as well. There are no doctrines that are changed by the differences within these texts. They were very lovingly and carefully copied, and yet there are times when people are human, so sometimes people made a mistake. But it demonstrates the fact that we have so many copies. It demonstrates that the Word of God has indeed been faithfully preserved throughout the ages.